This is ABC News legal analyst Royal Oakes welcoming you to Hinshaw Culbertson's Insurance Law Program, where we discuss insurance and reinsurance issues of interest to industry professionals. Here's your host, the co-chair of Hinshaw's Global Insurance Services Practice Group, Scott Seaman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Insurance Law. I'm Scott Seaman, and on this episode, we're going to pick up on our discussion of ESG and talk about where ESG has come from and where in the hell it's heading. Our guest once again is Bessie Dashbach. She is a partner at Hinshaw Culbertson's New Orleans office. She is, as I've said before, a very experienced environmental lawyer, and she's doing the quarterbacking of our firm's multidisciplinary approach to ESG. Welcome back, Bessie.
Thank you, Scott. I'm glad to be back.
Regardless of people's personal opinions on ESG, it seems to be pretty evident that every turn you're going to run into E, S, or G, correct?
Yes, I agree with that, Scott. Really, regardless on where you fall on the debate about whether or why ESG should be happening, it really is. In fact, it can feel a little bit like everything everywhere all at once. In the forefront is the greening of the energy sector for sure, but that's really just one facet. ESG is showing up in just about every sector. For example, we are seeing it in lending and insurance screenings, and I think there's really more to come. It is trending very heavily in business schools across the country. And frankly, if the internet is any indicator of how pervasive ESG is, I know that there was something like a 5-fold growth in internet searches for ESG since 2019 alone.
Well, and that says it all. What is driving ESG to show up in all these different ways?
Well, Robin Nuttall at McKinsey suggests that the rise in ESG is really due to both external forces on companies like customers as much as internal forces, namely their workforce. He describes a shift in stakeholder attitudes across the board. In fact, by his count, something like 70% of employees now demand purposeful work. That is, they want the company they work for to take a strong position on social issues. He also points to customers making choices in the marketplace based on purpose and sustainability.
Any ideas on what lies behind that?
Well, the fact is that customers and the workforce, including management, are dominated more and more by millennials, Gen Z, and Gen X, who are rapidly replacing baby boomers. In fact, as you have observed, Scott, the educational, experiential, methodological value and demographic differences are really having a large influence. Not only have corporations adjusted to create a workplace that attracts and retains millennials, Generation X, and Generation Z talent, these workers are increasingly becoming the corporate decision makers. And because of that, corporations are now becoming entities that increasingly are seeking and effectuating change rather than entities that are resisting change.
Well, your language is much too sophisticated to represent anything that I ever would have said. But I will say that there is no yin to hold back the yang. In other words, all the momentum for the most part is pushing ESG, government, employee-based. So the pace of it, I think, is partially responsible for what we're seeing now. And it's the younger generations in general that are not only comfortable with it, but driving it both internally and externally. And so, in some ways you say, is ESG about advancing social consciousness? Is it about advancing political agendas? Is it about advancing special interest? Is it about advancing the main interest of companies to stay in business and make money? And I guess part of it is that and maybe beyond.
Yeah, I do think it goes beyond, as you said, just advancing special interest. It's certainly been criticized as such. But I think on a very concrete level, ESG has been driven by the businesses really striving for sustainability. And by sustainability, I mean survival and success. And to do that, businesses just have to answer to their markets, whether they're answering to investment, lending, customer, or talent markets. And so with that, ESG is bringing along a new framework for risk mitigation as well as opportunity. And doing ESG can mean that by doing good, companies can do better in those very markets.
I think.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that that's very true. yet there often seems to be a political component to ESG, and companies need to be careful about crossing some lines because different stakeholders may view some ESG issues differently, and there are a wide range of views within a particular stakeholder. And so you mentioned a framework. What is that shaping up like?
Well, Scott, there have been really some major developments in the last year, and they do seem to be coming with increasing frequency this year. The first, dating back to last year and still on the table, is the SEC's new proposed rules calling for disclosure of climate-related risk and greenhouse gas emissions. If that rule is finalized, public companies would have to report direct greenhouse gas emissions, known as Scope 1, as well as indirect pollution from purchased electricity and other forms of energy. Also, those are known as Scope 2. Companies might even have to report on Scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions from supply chains. And separate from the reporting on greenhouse gas emissions is a whole nother set of the rules addressing climate risks that companies face, including down to the location of assets that might be subject to climate-related risks. Large companies would have to give assurances about the reliability of all of this information, and the information would need to be disclosed in registration statements and annual reports, including their Form 10K filings. Companies might also have to disclose what they perceive as risks and emissions through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that was issued by the EU. That CSRD will become effective in 2024, and it really does expand the reach of EU reporting obligations on E and also on S issues. I'll also note that the rules from the EU, the CSRD, those will apply to non-EU businesses if they meet certain criteria. And also new rules in Germany reaching back into supply chains will apply to German companies, but also to non-German companies that meet certain criteria. And there is also a much longer list of proposed rules that are still in the works across the EU addressing sustainability investments and also emissions.
Well, the future of ESG turns on what is required of companies by law and regulation, but there's a lot more to it, isn't there?
Yeah, there is a lot more to it. I mean, driving ESG is also what can be characterized as voluntary efforts. You know, companies undertaking ESG initiatives really entirely on their own and really leveraging ESG in their own favor. When it comes to ESG reporting, these stats are really quite telling. More than 90% of S&P 500 companies are engaging in ESG reporting, and approximately 70% of Russell 1000 companies are engaging in ESG reporting. In fact, Deloitte's latest survey shows that almost 3 in 5, or 57% of executives have already implemented a cross-functional ESG council or an ESG working group, and also that most others are already working on one. In fact, a majority of 81% of executives report that new roles and responsibilities have already been created to accommodate additional disclosure requirements that are either in the works and or anticipated.
And so you have companies not wanting to be out ESG'd by other companies and companies wanting to out ESG other companies. And I guess part of that explains the uptick in voluntary ESG initiatives.
It does, Scott. That really brings us back to, the idea of what are markets demanding? We're really looking beyond social conscience, beyond special interest. There really is more to it. As put by Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, a prudent public company will find it really desirable to establish its own criteria for determining the scope and content of its ESG disclosures, both to mitigate legal risk and to identify future opportunities. As I look at it, it really comes down to value creation. As I've said, do good and also do better. The Houston Chronicle, in that same report that I mentioned, said that 58% of oil and gas executives have actually already said that enhanced trust and stakeholders is a real business benefit of ESG reporting. And they cited that trust as a key factor in growing revenue, improving profitability, attracting talent and investors, and really building a stronger brand. Now, all that said, all that good news aside, it is really important to keep in mind that the upsides of ESG can only be real if the ESG initiatives themselves are.
And not only if they're real, but if they're solid and well purposed.
Exactly. I think that making ESG representations that aren't accurate or true can really expose a business to not only brand shaming, but exposure and enforcement actions and litigation. In fact, the SEC brought 3 enforcement actions just last year. In one, it charged a Brazilian mining company with misleading investors about the safety of a dam prior to its collapse. And the SEC also charged investment advisors for misstatements and omissions, including in one instance concerning the use of ESG considerations in making investment decisions for management of mutual funds. In addition to that, consumer actions and security litigation around ESG are also showing up with increasing frequency, and really some class actions are also anticipated. On those consumer and securities litigation claims, right now, those are really based on misstatements rather than omissions. Some examples that have survived motions to dismiss have been representations as to the sourcing of luxury winter jackets, labor conditions of workers who produce cocoa beans, and even environmental sustainability of shoes. There's also been action around representations that sourcing was, quote, ethical, responsible, and sustainable. I'll also note, Scott, that the plaintiffs in these cases are pointing to representations made not only in environmental reports, but also representations on product labels, websites, social media, and marketing materials. Also, shareholders have brought some derivative actions alleging securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty claims based on a company's ESG disclosures and pointing to some of those same materials that I've just mentioned. Also, I think it's important to point out that in addition to these claims, there has been claims for breach of fiduciary duty against individual directors and officers. And really, as we're watching the uptick in ESG-related litigation, I think the bottom line is that as ESG standards really become stricter, there is really an increasing risk of claims like this around them.
And I have to say, one of the ways to tell how invasive or pervasive something is whether it's giving rise to new terms and new concepts. And ESG certainly is doing that. Some folks now speak of greenflation, and some of the claims you referred to are greenwashing claims. So we've got that going on. And it's important, I think, not only internally for companies to be on top of it, but really they need to rely on their lawyers. And how is it the lawyers can help on ESG, Bessie?
Yeah, so, at a high level, services for lawyers, in addition to around this litigation, of course, their services from lawyers could include regulatory compliance. That's compliance with existing regulations, but also so many of the anticipated frameworks that we've talked about in the US, the federal, state level, and also Europe. There's also a role for lawyers in risk and liability assessments, in addressing, board composition, how are boards structured, and counseling how those boards address ES&G issues. Lawyers can be involved in designing initiatives, policies, programs, and even trainings to ensure that those ESG-related undertakings really do stand up. Lawyers could be very helpful, I think, in internal audits and supply chain management. And of course, really just in ordinary, everyday document drafting and review where ESG components may show up. And that's really just a few examples, Scott. I think even from those, though, it's evident that the practice of ESG for lawyers can cover a lot of territory. And it might also be evident that what comes within the practice of ESG as a legal space is not entirely new. I would venture that most lawyers' clients, corporate clients, are probably already doing some kind of ESG, even if they're not calling it that. And most lawyers who are in the corporate space are probably doing some kind of ESG work, even, again, if they're not calling it that. I think we might actually pause and ask ourselves, given the broad expanse of what the E, S, and the G cover, what legal work doesn't really touch on some issue of environment, social, or governance? And That said, as to what would be categorized as new when we refer to ESG, I think the actual deliverables will really be client-driven, based on what is material to any given client, what is it they're doing internally, and how and who are they going to tell about it.
And Bessie, that's sort of the beauty of you, which is you're, very capable environmental lawyer, and you can handle that aspect really on your own. But what companies need, and I think what law firms need, is some quarterbacking, somebody to look at the bigger picture. Because if you're doing something on E, it could affect G or S or vice versa. So you could almost do, one of those old comedy routines on ESG, but you really need to think big picture, see how the pieces fit together. So with all of that, do you have any advice for lawyers and their clients looking at the area?
Scott, I would point to a note from the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance again. This one's from 2020. As Harvard put it, companies that are out of step with public opinion and market demands may face reputational consequences. So really said another way, ESG is about identifying and mitigating risk, but also identifying and capturing opportunities for businesses to differentiate themselves, to really be the first entrant in a market. And given the trajectory of ESG to date, as you referenced, it's fast and furious. And so my advice to lawyers and also to their clients is really not only you better pay attention, but be very careful you don't get left behind.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Harvard, and I suppose Harvard would expect to have the last word on the subject and in this episode. Betsy, thank you so much. We've covered the fundamentals of ESG in the past couple of episodes. We're going to have you back, I'm sure, many times in the future to address at greater depth some of the specific issues and also how it impacts different industries in different ways. So feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to reach out to Bessie or me with any ESG issues that you may have. And once again, thank you all for joining us on Insurance Law.
The information on our insurance law program is provided for general information purposes only. Nothing stated on the program constitutes legal advice or creates an attorney-client relationship. You should consult directly with an attorney of your choosing if you'd like to obtain any advice with respect to any claim, case, or matter. Any views expressed are those of the guests and are not necessarily the views of Hinshaw Culbertson or any of its clients. For information on past and upcoming programs, visit the Insurance and Reinsurance page on www.hinshawlaw.com and click on Multimedia.